All right, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be ranking every single episode of The Owl House that has aired so far. Now, I know the show is technically on hiatus right now, and we will be getting a second half to season two at some point, as well as some specials in season three to wrap up the series. However, I feel like with this being the middle of this hiatus, I figured now would be a good time to sit down and really think about the best episodes of the show and where the show itself is at this point. And this was a tough list to put together. I mean, The Owl House is a pretty consistent show, and I feel like it has a bevy of great episodes. And on top of that, even the worst episodes of the show are pretty all right, which made the list kind of hard to put together. So while some episodes might be relatively low on the list, that doesn't necessarily mean I think it's a bad episode. But let's not waste any more time. Let's dive right into this list. This is going to take forever. So, starting off the list at number 29, the worst episode of The Owl House for me is Hootie's Moving Hassle. Now, again, I mean, with a show like The Owl House, I feel like most of the episodes are at least consistent. And I feel like this episode, despite it being the worst, would still be, like relatively within the middle tier of a lot of other shows like Total Drama or MLP. But with this one, this is just the least interesting in my opinion. I mean, a lot of it revolves around Luce, Willow, and Gus turning the house to life and going around, which is fine, but not super interesting. The side plot of Ida playing Hex's Hold'em is okay, but aside from Ida valuing her addiction over getting the elixir, not much really comes out of it. There are a few interesting moments, like the reveal that Willow and Amity used to be friends, and Amity not being super thrilled hanging out with the more popular kids. But even then, I feel like these things are expanded upon in other episodes, which we'll be talking about later in this video. I mean, at the end of the day, this episode just doesn't feel like much at all. I mean, this was definitely one that I wasn't really looking forward to when watching it. And while it's not bad, I mean, again, with a show like The Owl House, every other episode I feel like has something to offer, and this one just has very little of it. I mean, a lot of it seems to focus on this fantasy element of turn the house to life in The Conjuring, which is all right, but aside from that, I mean, not really much. So because of that, I have this one here at number 29. Now we're moving on to number 28, and I debated having this one a little higher on the list. I mean, as I feel like it does have a bit more going for it, but at the end of the day, I figured that it belonged down here. And at number 28, we have Sense and Insensitivity. Now, again, another all right episode, although one that feels a bit more cliche than some of the other ones, and definitely one that just isn't as interesting as the others. I mean, a lot of it comes down to King, like stealing Luce's work for the writing contest and in turn publishing his book, which is okay. I mean, he gets a bit of fame out of it. He gets Luce jealous in the process. A lot of like stuff that you would normally expect with a plot like this. Now, it does have a couple things going for it that makes it a little interesting, like how the publisher decides to kidnap King in order to force him to write, how he also tries to lure in Luce so that both of them can collaborate together to make something interesting. And of course, obviously, his whole plot of turning all these writers into like little tiny cube things is kind of interesting. But at the end of the day, I mean, this is just a season one episode that doesn't really bring much to the table in terms of the rest of the series. I mean, I feel like compared to a lot of the other episodes we'll be talking about, this one is less consequential in that a lot of it is just involving King and Luce's antics along the way. So because of that, I decided to have this one here at number 28. Now we're moving on to number 27, and I'll admit that this episode probably isn't as enjoyable for me than Sense and Insensitivity, but it does have at least a bit more going for it, and we have really small problems. Now, again, I feel like this episode is largely boring. I mean, Tibbles is kind of annoying as a villain, and his whole plot of shrinking everyone down so they can be killed is kind of eh. But the main reason this episode is above the ones we just talked about is King. I mean, he at least has an interesting motivation of wanting to spend more time with Luce now that she's hanging out more at Hexside. I feel like that's really something that drives the conflict in the episode with him wanting to use his shrinking spray, thinking it's a disappearing spray. And obviously, he gets in a little bit of trouble for that. I mean, although it's probably not as much as you would probably expect. But at the end of the day, I mean, this episode is still largely one that I don't really care about that much compared to a lot of the others. But it's the main thing of King like being a real driving force for the plot that keeps it at least semi interesting in my view. So I have this one here at number 27. Now we're moving on to number 26. And I know there are people out there who enjoy this episode. And again, when we're talking about the Owl House, I mean, I don't think there's a truly bad episode, but I feel like compared to the others, I have it relatively low. And at number 26, we have Once Upon a Swap. Now, again, I know there are people that will defend this episode. Like they'll talk about how funny it is, or how it's interesting seeing the different segments and how they really tried something new with the show. But for me, a lot of this episode just feels like filler. In general, body swap episodes don't really interest me, and I don't think this one really breaks new ground. Now, there is one notable moment where Luce is arrested while in Ida's body, and Lilith reveals that both of them wanted to join the Emperor's Coven as children. This, of course, plants the seeds for later episodes which explore Ida's backstory, and you can get the episode credit for planting that seed, but it feels like it only exists for that scene to happen. I mean, the rest of the episode is just kind of, yeah. I mean, you have obviously King going to the cafe, like and getting stuck there. I mean, I didn't really care for the villainous like owners of them that were trying to keep him there and keep the teenagers out. Didn't really care for that. I mean, also Ida's storyline is just kind of all right as well. And again, a lot of this episode just feels like filler. I mean, I know other shows like Steven Universe have episodes like this as well, where again, despite being mostly story driven, trying to have every episode try to contribute in some way to either the character development or the story, they'll usually have like one or two filler episodes here and there. Whereas this is just pure filler. I mean, well, again, it's not the other only show that does that. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not something I enjoy. So again, this is an alright episode, but probably not for me. It's here, number 26. Now we're moving on to number 25, and we have a pretty notable episode, in my opinion. Maybe not everyone's favorite, but it's notable enough. It is the pilot of the show. It is A Lying Witch and a Warden. Now, again, it's the pilot, so you give this episode credit for introducing us to the characters and to the world, and I think it does a good job at both of those things. I also like Luz pretty early on, where I feel bad for her that she gets into trouble and has trouble making friends as well. There's even a few wholesome moments in the conformatorium as well with the different prisoners. I mean, my personal favorite is the one that enjoys writing fan fiction. Now, before seeing the show for the first time, I actually heard about this particular character, and I actually thought Luce also like writes fan fiction. However, when it came down to watching it, I found out I was wrong. So that's something there. There are good moments in this episode, but at the end of the day, the biggest thing holding this one back is the fact that it's a pilot and has to dedicate all of its time to setting everything up, whereas other episodes we'll be talking about later on benefit from having things already in motion. And to be fair, the fact that I have the pilot this low is a testament to how well the show builds upon the characters, the story, the world over time, and gets better. So while I respect this episode for doing its job well, I can't justify putting it too high in the list. I mean, again, at the end of the day, it's a pretty simple plot of Luce getting introduced to everything and then sort of breaking into the conformatorium and kind of accepting her role as a weirdo. So, pretty basic stuff. It's here at number 25. Now we're moving on to number 24, and this one might be a bit controversial. I mean, I know there are people out there who adore this episode and think there are some great moments in there, and I agree to some extent, but at the end of the day, I feel like it's just kind of good as an episode, and I feel like there are other ones that are definitely better than it. And believe it or not, it's actually the first season 2 episode on the list. Now, generally speaking, I think season 2 is better than season 1. I feel like it's a stronger season and definitely has a stronger, more consistent set of episodes. But at number 24, we have the penultimate episode that has aired so far, and that is Eclipse Lake. Now, this episode is fine. But I always had the feeling that it was more of a transitional piece than anything. There's some good stuff, like Luce being sick and having to stay home. There's Amity worrying about Luce's text messages. There's Hunter feeling like he needs to produce results or else he'll be killed. And I also like the moment where Amity gives up the portal key but gets Untitled blood anyway by squeezing it so tightly that it cracks a bit. I mean, that was kind of clever. I mean, this is a good episode and there are decent elements to it. But the more I think about it, the less remarkable it is on its own. It's surrounded by two other episodes, obviously with knocking on Hootie's door coming right before it, and Yesterday's Lie coming immediately afterwards. And obviously both those episodes have some pretty significant plot developments, and I feel like this episode serves more as a bridge between those two episodes than anything significant on its own. So while I think this episode is good and has some good moments, I feel like it's definitely overshadowed by the episodes that come around it, both in terms of the episodes themselves, but also in terms of their significance to the overall series. So I have this one here at number 24. All right, moving on to number 23. And the next couple episodes we'll be talking about kind of fit into this sub tier of inconsistent episodes where you'll have one storyline that's pretty good, but then another storyline that's just kind of and something I don't really care about. But at number 23, we have Escape of the Palacemen. And I feel like this episode kind of embodies what I was just talking about, where I feel like the main storyline has promise with Albert scared of Luce and Luce trying to regain his trust, but in execution, it's just really boring. I mean, it's kind of cool seeing the abandoned palisman and seeing how the Bat Queen has taken it upon herself to protect them, even if I find her a bit obtuse towards Luce about it. Now, the side plot is a bit more fun with King trying to own some kids on the playground, like and turning Ida into her cursed form and getting her in trouble in the process. But even then, I felt like it was just kind of all right. Again, I feel like a lot of the episode's issues stem from the fact that we don't get a lot of time dedicated to the main plot, where, yes, the side plot is good, but I feel like it does take away some time that could have been dedicated towards fleshing out the main plot a bit more. I feel like if the episode focused more on how Luce feels bad for Albert and how Albert is genuinely scared of Luce, then I feel like it would have been a more effective episode. But I feel like as it is, it's just kind of all right. And because of that, I have it here at number 23. Now we're moving on to number 22. And again, we're continuing with this tier of inconsistent episodes. Although I feel like this episode's inconsistencies are a bit less clear than the one we just talked about. But at number 22, we have Something Ventured, Someone Framed. And I feel like this is a good episode, but not without its problems. So I feel like a lot of the main problems come from the main storyline again, where we have Gus's leadership being challenged by Bartholomew, prompting Gus to sneak loose into the school to keep his position, even though she's still technically banned at this point in the show. And we see him try to make this work by taking down all the banned posters around. But instead of throwing them in the trash or burning them, he hangs onto the stack long enough to drop them all over the floor and allowing Bartholomew to find them and snitch on them. And to me, that just felt really dumb. Where it would have been better if the episode opened with the kids walking down the hall before like the conflict started and just having to pass by one of the posters, or even better if the Human Appreciation Society took like a group photo with the band poster in the background, like something that would allow Bartholomew to find out that Luce is banned without making Gus seem like a complete idiot. Like, why are you holding on to all those posters? Like, even though you're still collecting them, why are you holding on to them still? I mean, I felt that was a bit annoying as well. I also thought that there were other elements that just didn't entirely work. I mean, while the detention scene is pretty good, I mean, I feel like there were some forced elements to it, like Gus talking about how he skipped a grade and how that's making it hard for him to fit in and make friends, and why that makes it really important for him to be in the Human Appreciation Society. Like, I felt that was kind of forced, in my opinion. And then obviously with Bartholomew having recently transferred to like the school. I mean, that was kind of whatever. Now the side plot is a bit better where Ida is trying to convince Bum to let Ida loose into the school by obviously rectifying some of the stuff that she did. And I thought that was pretty cool. I felt like the two of them had some good chemistry. I felt like it sort of taught us a bit more about Ida, like learning how she is someone who caused a lot of trouble when she was a student at Hexa, and how she there was once a time where she was a part of the system that she has since rejected. I thought that was pretty good. But it's really that main plot that I found a bit disappointing. And even at the end, when like Gus is removed from the society and Bartholomew's made the president, I felt like that was kind of an unceremonious end to that storyline. Again, at the end of the day, this is a pretty good episode, but I feel like it has some rockiness to its main storyline. And that's really what's keeping it down here at number 22. Now we're moving on to number 21, and continuing with the sub tier, we have Adventures in the Elements. Now, what separates this episode from the previous two we talked about is that while those episodes had a weak main plot or a flawed main plot, but a decent side plot, this episode kind of has the opposite problem where it has a weaker side plot, but a pretty solid main plot. And that's really the main reason that I have this one higher than those two, even if I feel like the side plots from the other two episodes might give me a bit more enjoyment. So thing about this episode is the main plot's good. Like Lewis is desperate to learn a second spell to avoid being put in the baby classes. And that's something I can very much relate to. So obviously she brings Ida along, and Ida's kind of stubborn about it. I mean, not really helpful, which isn't great, but like we have Luce like in this environment, like the snowy environment. I thought that was interesting. We have her try to mend things with Amity, but screws up once again when she takes her practice wand and uses up all of its battery just to make herself feel powerful. I thought that was a pretty good moment for her. Like, obviously, and a pretty natural reason for Luce to do something that would make Amity mad at her. And in the end, Luce is able to learn a second spell, which kind of becomes friends with Amity in the process. I mean, there's some decent development there. And really, the main plot is good. However, the side plot is really nothing, in my opinion, with King bringing toys to life and bossing them around. It was extremely boring. I mean, even worse than like some of the side plots we were just talking about. I mean, I just did not care for it at all. But again, the reason I have this episode above those ones is that at least it's a side plot. It's not the main focus of the episode. It's not the thing taking up the bulk of the runtime. And I feel like at the end of the day, that kind of makes it more harmless than anything else. So because of that, I have this episode here at number 21. Now we're moving on to number 20, and we're wrapping up with this sub tier of inconsistent episodes. And I wanted to put this one a bit higher. I mean, this one episode has a very notable moment, as we'll be talking about shortly. And I wanted to put it higher as I really enjoy the main plot of this episode. However, it ultimately falls into this inconsistent tier. So, at number 20, we have Through the Looking Glass Ruins. And again, this is a tale of two episodes, where on one hand, you have the main plot, which is about Amity and Luce. And that is a very strong main plot with Luz convincing Amity to take her into the library's restricted section, but getting Amity fired after they get caught. There's this great scene outside the library where, I mean, the supervisor that fires her isn't really that mad at Amity, but just sounds very disappointed. I thought that was particularly noteworthy there. We see Luz trying to apologize, but Amity kind of pushes back and she kind of tells her off, saying that Luz always causes her to do stupid things. Obviously, both of them get very emotional. That's a very strong scene right there. This is followed up with Ed and M talking to Amity about her feelings and dyeing Amity's hair in the process. And of course, there's Amity telling Luce that she always finds a way of sneaking into people's hearts and then kissing you on the cheek, only to run away like, okay, good to see you. Farewell forever. I mean, all that's great. I mean, and obviously it's a big turning point in the show. It's a big turning point for Amity and Luce's relationship. All of that is great. However, there's also the Gus storyline, and I feel like people tend to forget about this one when they talk about this episode, but it's there, and I just didn't care for it. I mean, it's just not nearly as interesting. I mean, a lot of it hinges on illusionists being looked down on, and I guess everyone learns at the end that illusionists aren't so bad, but I don't really care. I mean, yeah, you have this old guy show up and something about a garden happens, but at the end of the day, it's the Lumity stuff that really defines this episode. And while I wanted to put the episode higher because of that, it's the Gus storyline and really that kind of dead space. like where that episode just takes dedicates time towards that storyline that keeps this episode down. So I have it here at number 20. All right, now we're moving on to number 19. And I feel like from this point on the list, I would consider the remaining episodes to be solid. And by number 19, we probably have the least solid of this bunch, but still a pretty good episode in my eyes. And that is Wing It Like Witches. I was tempted to put this episode a little higher as it's pretty fun. I mean, you have Luce trying to help Willow and Gus get good at Grudgeby through montages and other sports movie cliches. There's even a shot at Harry Potter where obviously there's like an instant win mechanism, like akin to like the Golden Snitch. This is also the point in the series where Amity becomes incapable of talking to Luce without blushing. Like, I always make fun of her for that. I mean, there's plenty of good moments there. I mean, even the side plot where Ida and Lilith play a match is somewhat interesting. I mean, this is a good episode and really a pretty lighthearted episode considering like all what just happened in the Grom episode and what's to come like towards the end of season one. But the reason I have it lower is just it's competition. I feel like the remaining episodes on the list are all have a lot more going for them. I feel like there's more to really chew on with them. And I feel like this episode, while it is fun and it's nice, like homage to different sports movies, like it's just I mean, I'll admit to not being the biggest sports movie fan in the world, so I mean, not everything exactly resonates with me, but it's still pretty fun nonetheless, and I have it here at number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and we have a relatively early episode from the show, and definitely one of the more foundational episodes for setting up the show's world. And at number 18, we have The Intruder. Now, again, I like this episode quite a bit. Obviously, it's the episode that introduces Ida's curse, and we spend a lot of the episode kind of like with this mystery over what this creature is and why it's terrorizing the house, only to find out towards the end that it's really Ida and that she really needs her elixir in order to calm down her curse. And I think a lot of that's pretty good. I like the way it's handled. Again, I feel like a lot of the reason it's here though is because of competition. I feel like other episodes expand more upon Ida's curse and like the different aspects of it to where I find those episodes more interesting. And plus, I feel like a lot of it is centered around horror, like them trying to figure out this mystery as this thing that we don't know is Ida yet is trying to devastate things. Like, not the biggest fan of that genre, like in that didn't really affect my enjoyment too much of it, but again, I feel like other episodes handle Ida's curse better and really go more into the ramifications of it. So because of that, I have this episode here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and again, we're sticking with some of the earlier episodes of the show. It's actually the episode right before The Intruder. It is I Was a Teenage Abomination. Now, obviously, this is Amity's introduction episode, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, compared to what she becomes later on, she's really arrogant and elitist. At the same time, there's a level of sadness coming from her obsession with the top student badge. I mean, one of my favorite moments of the episode is when she says, I want my badge. I mean, like on the surface, she comes off as someone with a very tiny world focused entirely around school that Luce has suddenly shattered. And the fact that she cares so much about grades and what professors think of her is just sad to me. And obviously, we see in later episodes that she grows and sort of learns to build her identity and her relationships beyond just school. But then later episodes add some additional context where, of course, she comes from an elitist family who are probably very disappointed that their own offspring got surpassed by Willow, of all people. And aside from that, this episode is an adequate introduction to Hexside and some of the tracks, and on the whole, it's an adequate episode. So the reason this episode's higher than say the pilot is that there's a bit more going on, like even as it's world building. I mean, obviously you learn about Hexside and you get a bit of a taste towards how conformist and restrictive this society can be with people being on specific tracks, even if people like Willow struggle a lot with their given track and how they don't seem to have many options to get out of it normally. And of course, Amity, being herself, of course. I mean, Amity is really the highlight of this episode for me, and obviously we get a good taste of what she's like, and really when we see how much she grows, like this episode offers a good introduction to her, and giving us a sense of where she's starting out and how much she grows, giving us a greater appreciation for her as a character. But again, competition is the main reason this episode is as low as it is. I have it here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and we're jumping way forward now to season 2, talking about another episode regarding Palacemen. It is Hunting Palacemen. Now, I feel like when thinking about this episode, I think a lot about Eclipse Lake, where some of it feels like a transitional piece. But on the other hand, I feel like this episode definitely stands more on its own. I mean, obviously, this is the episode where Luce really tries to get her own Palacemen and really comes to terms with the fact that a big reason she has stayed on the Boiling Isles for so long is because she sees it as an escapist fantasy, and she never really took the time to think about what she wants to use magic for beyond like either silly stuff or especially at this point trying to get back to her home. I mean, obviously the show kind of confronts its own premise a bit with that episode. I mean, obviously you have Lou's really struggling to get her own Palaceman. We obviously learn a lot more about Hunter. We finally see his face and learn his name. And there's some seeds planted there towards him eventually getting a redemption arc. So all that's pretty good. And I always find it interesting how the episode makes it seem at first that like the cardinal Palaceman would end up going to lose, but I think by the halfway point, like it made it clear that it would actually end up going to Hunter, which I find a bit interesting. Like that's the outcome that ends up happening. So I think there's stuff going on there. There's setup towards Hunter's redemption arc. There's setup of Luce thinking more about why she wants to eventually go home, or if at all. But the reason I see this more as a transitional piece is because, again, a lot of it does lay the groundwork for these ideas that are going to define the second half of the series. But again, I feel like not much progress is actually made in realizing those goals. I feel like this is definitely something that's going to have a lot more payoff later on once the show gets off hiatus. So again, I debated over whether to have it at the same spot as Eclipse Lake, but I figured it had a bit more going for it than Eclipse Lake. It kind of stands a bit more on its own, even as I feel like a lot of it does seem to be there to set up future developments with the show. So because of that, I have this episode here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and we're jumping way back now. We're actually at the earliest episode still on the board, and that is Witches Before Wizards. Now, I'm sure this may seem like a weird, unconventional pick here, but I think this is a great early episode when all the characters are still pretty raw. I mean, we see a lot of the baggage that Luce brings over from the human world, offering some insight into her character, where obviously she still very much sees the Boiling Isles as this escapist fantasy from all the troubles and all the isolation she had back in the human world. And sure, we know from the pilot episode that, again, that basic idea, but I feel like this episode is what really expands upon this idea with her wanting to be this chosen one and her like still not recognizing that there's limitations and bounds and quote unquote reality on the Boiling Isles that are obviously there on Earth. And obviously she tries to escape that by again being manipulated by this wizard to go on this quest and really be seen as this chosen one. And what really struck me about this episode was the climax where Ida and King are coming to save her, and she really has to choose between staying in this fantasy where all these figments of her imagination are telling her that she'll be loved and she'll be this chosen one. She can remain forever in this comfortable reality where she's accepted, or she can go back and really help these people that she actually met and actually cares about. And I feel like that was a very powerful scene for her to make that decision to escape this comfortable, safe reality in favor of saving her new friends and really continuing to make the Boiling Isles this fantasy where she can really grow as a person while again also doing some good stuff along the way. So I think this episode is definitely more effective at building upon Luce's character than the pilot is. And I think it's a pretty underrated episode. I don't think many people talk about it, but again, it's still pretty early episode. There's still a lot that the show has offered that just hasn't been set up yet. So I have this one here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14. And again, another pretty solid episode. Not without its problems, but I definitely appreciate this one a lot. And it's another season one episode. It is Lost in Language. Again, it's a pretty good episode with Luce wanting to get closer to Amity. This is the introduction to Ed and M. And the first time I watched it, I got the impression that we weren't supposed to like them. I mean, their plan of publishing her diary to the entire school is pretty harsh to make me think that they were actually good people. Now, future episodes rectify this, of course, and in hindsight, it goes to show how realistically a lot of these sibling relationships are written on this show. But it was still a weird experience I had the first time watching it. So the scene of them in the Amity's hangout is pretty great with Luce reading the diary entries. I like how the entries are manifested with a little hologram of Amity talking to herself. And of course, some of these are pretty revealing where she calls her teacher mom. She says she doesn't have a place to go. And then there's Amity catching Luce. I mean, completely blushing up as she's like, really? And then afterwards, she calls Luce a bully. A lot of great stuff there. Now, I have a few nitpicks with the mechanism for books coming to life. Like, I get how drawing in the books can alter their manifestations, but how do some angry eyebrows, teeth, and claws cause Ottoman to suddenly grow 10 times his size? I mean, wouldn't he still be small? Also, it was interesting how they tied the storybook into the side plot with Ida babysitting the bats, even if I found the side plot a bit rushed. So, on the whole, I feel like this was a pretty good episode. I mean, with some minor nitpicks with the world building aspects to it, but I feel like it has a lot going for it. It's here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13. We're continuing on with this string of pretty solid episodes, and we're jumping forward to season 2. We have Escaping Expulsion. Now, this is another pretty solid episode, and the first real focus we get for Amity's parents. Now, as a side note, I find it kind of ironic that Adalia, this conservative, class conscious aristocrat, is voiced by Rachel McFarlane, who also plays Haley Smith on American Dad. So you can kind of get a sense of the dichotomy there. Anywho, we get a good sense of how controlling she is, getting Luce, Willow, and Gus expelled simply for being the wrong people for Amity to associate with. And even having this crystal that she uses to speak telepathically to her children, which allows her to be mean and controlling to them, while also appearing dignified and respectable on the outside. I find that pretty cool. You can also see how torn up Principal Bump is by having to keep out these kids when you can tell they likes him a lot and he gets really torn up. I mean, I kind of like Principal Bump as a character, and I thought that was really cool. I like how Luce takes it upon herself to get her and her friends back into the school, even if it involves putting herself in danger. And the action scene's pretty good as well, even if it goes a bit too far with Adalia trying to kill Luce. But through that, we get good character development for Amity, first by saying, "Stay away from my Luce," and then by breaking the crystal, which was pretty cool. So, despite its placement on the list, I find this episode pretty good. I really like the characterization of Odalia and seeing just how nasty and like class conscious she is throughout. But again, it's really the competition that keeps this one here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and we're continuing on with season 2. I debated between this one and Escaping Expulsion, but I figured that I liked this one a little better. And here at number 12, we have Keeping Up Appearances. Again, pretty good episode. Obviously, this gives us Gwendolyn, like obviously Ida and Lilith's mother, and her efforts to cure Ida's curse. It's an interesting metaphor for scams, which we see in the real world through MLMs and pyramid schemes. I thought it was pretty cool to see how Gwendolyn is this pretty well intentioned mother who really wants to cure Ida and her curse, but at the same time doesn't seem to realize that Ida's at a point in her life now where she doesn't really want to be cured. At the same time, we get some good insight through their relationships. I mean, I just mentioned the one with Ida, but also the one with Lilith, where we kind of have this realistic outcome where Ida is seen as the more troubled one and gets the bulk of the attention, while Lilith feels neglected and ignored. And obviously, that drives a lot of her conflict in the episode. And The other factor is the fact that Gwendolyn doesn't even know that Lilith is cursed as well until the end, where both of them turned into their cursed forms, and it's up to Gwendolyn and Luce to save them. And the scene at the end was really nice, where Gwendolyn like comforts both of them. I thought that was really nice and good way to wrap up like their conflict. Though I will say that I was a bit disappointed at the end where Lilith ultimately decides to move out to spend more time with Gwendolyn. Where to me, like Lilith's inclusion into the regular cast was one of the more interesting developments from the end of season one to season two. To see her leave so soon was pretty disappointing in my eyes, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the rest of the episode is pretty strong, and I found it to be a pretty interesting commentary about these scams and MLMs and alternative medicines that don't really work. And of course, the core with Gwendolyn's relationships to her daughters is what really drives this episode. So I have it here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we're jumping back to season one now. And here we have The First Day. Again, another pretty good episode. Here we really see Luce's fascination of the Boiling Isles get her in trouble when she wants to study multiple tracks, only to be sent on the detention track. And I thought it was kind of cruel how they had to spend a whole year in detention before they can try again. The detention kids were also pretty good characters, and it was really awesome having them be avid learners that were just looked as too curious for their own good, and hence why they ended up in detention. You have an interesting turn of events as well when Willow and Gus come to break Luce out, making the other detention kids think that Luce looked down on them and that she was doing everything she can to not even associate with them. I thought that was a pretty interesting way to generate conflict there. And the resolution is pretty cool as well, which really exposes the flaws in the school's track system and really the society as a whole, where it really goes to show how all these restrictions are making the students and most of the population weak. I mean, we see most of the students getting curb stomped by this basilisk monster, and it really comes down to the detention kids and their curiosity, like with multiple tracks and combining them, that allows them to win at the end. And of course, the ending is pretty satisfying where Bump is willing to sidestep this entire, like specialized culture to allow these kids to study multiple tracks and to reward their curiosity. I thought that was a pretty strong message for the episode. And in general, it's a pretty fun story as well, where we really see Luce trying to navigate the school and really struggle to determine what it is she wants to learn. Obviously, that contributes on later episodes, as we were talking about with Hunting Palacemen earlier. Again, it's a pretty good episode with some pretty interesting twists and turns along the way, but landed just outside the top 10 for me. I have it here at number 11. All right, now we're in the top 10. And here at number 10, we have probably a controversial pick, as this episode is widely discussed as being one of the best episodes in the series. And even more than Through the Looking Glass Ruins, is seen as a pretty notable episode for the series. But I feel like when looking at the rest of the episodes left to talk about, I feel like number 10 is how I personally feel it lands. And here we have Enchanting Gromfright. I know. This is one of the most popular episodes and one of the first ones people think of when the show is brought up. Heck, I knew that when I started watching the show myself that this was one of the more prominent episodes. And it was a good episode. I really enjoyed it a lot, but I'm hard pressed to call this one of the best. First time I watched this, I had no idea that Grom would involve fighting some monster, which kind of threw me off at first. I started warming up to the concept once it became apparent that the monster's main form of attack is making people live through their worst fear, kind of like Somber's Door from MLP. Then we get to the actual scene where the monster plays out Luce and Amity's worst fears, and the more I think about it, the more I realize that Luce and Amity kind of have the same two worst fears, that they'll be rejected by the other, and that even if they were accepted, their parents would take that away, along, in Luce's case, with everything else good she has in the Boiling Isles. Granted, Luce's romantic feelings aren't explored too much here, but she's awfully quick to volunteer herself as Amity's date. I mean, I kind of like how Luce was the one to ask Amity out, and really everything they do with the note here is pretty good. So, yes, there's a lot of good stuff in this episode. I mean, it's in the top 10. But I'm not going to lie, I thought I would be more excited watching it, considering how big it is and how much it's talked about within the fandom. But instead, I found myself getting more out of other episodes, which is why I have it here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we're jumping forward to season 2 to talk about an episode that I was very invested in when I was watching it, and I felt like there was a lot of great stuff here. And at number 9, we have Echoes of the Past. Again, very good episode. Certainly one that was being set up for a while. I mean, King is a type of character designed so that the first time you see him, you know there's stuff about his background that would be addressed in future episodes. And this episode definitely delivers on that. Like, who is he and why is one of his horns broken? This episode, like I said, does a great job at that. I think what really makes this episode for me is the scene where it all clicks with King and he doesn't like it. I mean, Alex Hirsch does an incredible job at making King sound vulnerable and broken as he runs away. And obviously, all the while, you have Ida, who, upon hearing that King was bringing them to the castle, was the first to really jump against it, almost implying that King has done this before. And the rest of the episode's pretty good. It does a good job at setting up some mystery. I also liked how King is able to associate memories by touching specific objects. I thought that was an interesting way to incorporate flashbacks. And of course, we have the ending where we have this setup to this new storyline of King finding out who his real dad is, and obviously that becomes a major development throughout season 2, and one we haven't really got much closer to at this time. But like I said, this is a very strong episode. Definitely one that relies a lot on its atmosphere, but also on its voice acting. I mean, Alex Hirsch is an incredible voice actor, and this episode really demonstrates that. But I feel like the 80 episodes we'll be talking about definitely have more going for them. I feel like that's been a running theme with this list, where even great episodes like this are still relatively low on the list. So I have it here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and from this point on, I would consider this a top tier. I feel like the top 8 episodes are all fantastic episodes and definitely the very best of what the show has to offer. But at number 8, we have the season 1 finale. We have Young Blood, Old Souls. And this is a fantastic episode. Now, obviously, with it being the season finale, you expect there to be a pretty big climax and a lot of things to kind of come full circle. And it definitely delivers on that. I mean, well, first you have Bellows admitting that he lied to Lilith about, promising to heal Ida's curse when really he just wanted to petrifize her. And, that was kind of telegraphed, but it's still a pretty effective scene. You have Luce being mad at Lilith for turning Ida in and obviously lashing out as a result. You have the entire plot of Luce trying to save Ida from being petrified. We have the reveal of Lilith and Ida's backstory where Lilith was jealous of Ida and gave Ida the curse as a way to earn her spot on the Emperor's Coven when and it was kind of funny when Ida was like, I don't want it." And I thought that was pretty funny, sort of made it even more useless for Lilith to do that. Although, to be fair, I think it kind of makes it easier for Ida to forgive Lilith after finding that out. I'm glad we didn't have an episode that was just about Ida being bitter against Lilith for whatever reason, but it is what it is. And you also have the moment where Luce destroys the portal back to the human world. I thought that was a pretty clever scene where she's able to like lace all these glyphs onto the door before she gives it to him and obviously blows it up. And of course we have the climax scene, which is pretty good. Obviously they save the day, or at least get Ida and Lilith free. Obviously, Lilith decides to make things up by giving herself half the curse. I thought that was an interesting turning point for her character. And it ends with some, cliffhangers or previews of stuff that come in season 2, particularly with the Day of Unity. I mean, this episode pretty much has everything you would want out of a season finale. And obviously, there's a lot of high stakes involved. And again, I debated about putting this one a bit higher, but I just feel like the 7 episodes we'll be talking about are more complete episodes and definitely stand more on their own than just being the season finale. So I have this one here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we actually have the earliest episode left on the board, and that is Covention. Now, I consider putting this one a bit lower as it's still relatively early in the series, and a lot of its purpose is world building. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there's more to this episode than just that. I mean, yeah, we learn about the Coven system, which feels pretty boilerplate, but this is also the episode where we meet Lilith and get a glimpse into her relationship with Ida. All that is great. And I feel like they have a very great chemistry together on screen and obviously as siblings. And of course, there's Amity, who at this point in the series still doesn't like Luce. The entire duel sequence is pretty fun, where Ida cheats by making Luce better at magic than what she really is. But what's even more interesting is the revelation that Lilith is also cheating by enhancing Amity without her knowledge. And when Amity finds out about this, she is just horrified because she worries the public will label her as a cheater instead of Lilith and everyone else, which compromises her future. And from there, we get the scene where Luz tries to comfort Amity, but Amity is just upset and really tries to make Luz admit that she's not a real witch. And obviously, Luz does admit, but she's learning. And obviously, through that, Amity shows a little sign that she might be open to a Luz with undoing the permanent spell that she cast before the duel. I mean, this is a fantastic episode in my opinion. I feel like it's definitely a very foundational episode that does more than just set up the world and introduce covens and stuff. And I thought that there was a lot of interesting developments as well, especially with Lilith and Amity involved. Now, again, at the end of the day, it still doesn't quite reach the peak for me. I feel like there are other episodes that definitely expand upon a bit more, but I feel like this is still a fantastic episode, definitely one that I enjoy rewatching, and I have it here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have a pretty iconic episode, and that is Understanding Willow. Again, pretty solid episode, one that really expands upon Willow and Amity being childhood friends, which I mentioned earlier in the video. I kind of question the purpose of capturing one's memories on photographs, especially when there's a lot of risk involved for damaging them, as we see Amity pretty much burn a lot of them like an idiot, but that's more of a lore thing and a nitpick than anything else. But obviously, there's a lot going on here with Amity embarrassed at the memory of her and Willow being friends, causing the conflict in the first place. And then she's forced to join Luce in Willow's mind as she starts the whole mess. And we get some decent memory segments, which convey this childhood friendship pretty well. I like the flashback of Amity breaking off the friendship and subsequently Amity's memory of her parents telling her that Willow is beneath them and that they can't be friends anymore. Mind you, I'm kind of confused by how Amity is able to conjure up her own memory while in Willow's mind, but I can live with that. Aside from that, I really like the imagery of Willow's mind being a forest, only for the inner Willow to be burning it down along with her memories. I thought that was a good representation of Willow's character, obviously, with her being involved with the plant track and really liking that deep down, but also having her mind just be this forest and just the imagery of it all being consumed by flames is pretty good on its own. And like I said, the actual shots of the damaged memories is pretty poignant. And the ending is nice as well, where Amity starts to see Amity in a new light, even if they aren't close friends at this point. So I think there's a lot of great character stuff going on in this episode. I do have a couple nitpicks with, the lore stuff and the mechanism in which some of the stuff works, allowing it to happen. I mean, kind of like an issue I had with Lost in Language, but again, at the end of the day, this is a pretty solid episode, and it's here at number 6. All right, here we go. Now we're inside the top 5. And I guess as a bit of a spoiler, 4 of the top 5 are from season 2, which I think speaks to the caliber of episodes season 2 produces. And at number 5, we actually have the premiere of season 2. We have Separate Tides. Now, I love this episode. I actually debated putting it a bit lower as I questioned to myself whether it was really that good and whether it was worthy of being inside the top 5. And I debated and I decided, yeah, it was probably worth it. Now, what's interesting about this episode is that it kind of serves as a new pilot in a way where it's really setting up the new status quo. Like, I like the scene at the beginning where Luce sort of recaps what happens and establishes everything that's changed since the end of season one. Now, again, it has a lot of what it's going for with the pilot, but obviously it has the advantage of us already knowing these characters and there already being stuff that it can work with. And we get that with two pretty strong storylines. We have Luce's storyline where she feels like a burden. She feels like she's the reason Ida lost her magic, and with that, her financial means, and the reason she can't afford her apple blood because she's worried about what she needs to eat. Like, the pirate stuff is pretty fun, and seeing Luce bond with the crew is pretty wholesome. I really like that element of it. Obviously, Ida was the one who stole a lot of their loot. I mean, obviously, there's a scene of Ida confronting Luce where Luce explains why she needs to do this and how she wants to make it up to her. Like, I think that's a very powerful scene on its own, and obviously, the moment where Ida's comforts Luce and really assures her that Luce has made her life better. I mean, it really highlights the bond that they formed. I mean, obviously, it makes me really happy for both of them. Really increases my appreciation for Ida as a character. And obviously, it's a pretty powerful message to be teaching that Luce, like, yeah, like she may have this guilt going on, but she has a family and she has people that care about her and that she doesn't have to do it on her own. And even the side plot is interesting as well, where Lilith is coming to terms with her new circumstances, while Hootie tries being her friend. And Lilith has a very strong parallel to Luce at one point by feeling like she has to do stuff on her own to feel like she has worth. Oh, and for whatever reason, the part where she calls Hootie a weird bird worm always sticks out to me. Like, I just love it. But obviously, a lot of great stuff going on with Lilith as well. Like, I find it interesting how she's wearing a t-shirt with a low battery on it. I've heard some people say that this is meant to represent how she doesn't have any magic anymore. I like to see it as her being burnt out. Obviously, she's she's lost everything that she has lived for with the Emperor's Covenant and everything, and now she just feels burnt out, like she doesn't have much of a purpose outside of her actual magical ability. So I think that is another neat element as well. I mean, really, there's just so much to really get into this episode. I mean, obviously, the story is pretty good. I think there's a lot of little moments that really define this episode for me. And again, the best way I can sum it up is that it has all of the benefits of being a pilot while having almost none of the downsides. And that's a big reason that I have this episode as high as it is. But I feel like the top four episodes edge them out in some respect. So because of that, I have this episode here at number five. Now we're moving on to number four, and we have another pretty notable episode and really iconic in a lot of ways, and that is Ida's Requiem. And again, this is just a fantastic episode. So much of it centering around Ida, especially at this point in the series where she's seeing people that she's really grown closer to over the course of the series kind of start to drift apart from her to a certain extent. I mean, not completely, but I mean, obviously, this is after Lilith has moved out. I mean, King at this point is really focused on his storyline of finding his father, and Luce is trying to get the portal back working to visit back at Earth. So she's starting to feel like that she's kind of being brushed aside, and that every good thing that she's had in her life is starting to be pulled away. So obviously, that's a big focus for her there. Obviously, she reconnects with Rain. Obviously, Rain is a pretty notable character. Obviously, a pretty good representation for non-binary people. So it's pretty cool to see that in action. And aside from that, Rain's just a pretty interesting character where they're a part of this rebel group that's trying to undermine Belos and the regime. Obviously, Ida joins up with them to try and go on a mission that fails. And there's a pretty depressing scene where she's almost dies. Like, she's almost willing to kill herself with this fire, only for a picture of Luce and King to fly out. And Rain encourages her to go back to them because she has something to live for. Whereas Rain has kind of gotten to this point where they're willing to die for the cause. And speaking of Rain, like the ending where Rain is kept alive, but they're petrified and sort of kept frozen until the day of Unity was a pretty something on its own. I mean, obviously that's a pretty notable scene. Now, the one nitpick I have with this episode is the fact that, again, with King, like obviously a lot of his focus is him telling Ida that he's changed his name. But it relies on that old misunderstanding trope where he just has to say a word that suggests that he's leaving. I mean, he has to use the word legally for some reason. Like, why couldn't he just say change the name? Like, obviously, by you saying legally, she's going to cut you off because she assumes that you mean leave. I mean, I don't know. That kind of irked me a bit. And also, like the race side plot isn't really focused on too much. I mean, it's not that big of a deal, but again, like when we're getting to the very, very top, Mia is still a knock at the end of the day. But really, what elevates this episode is the story, like Ida's journey through this episode. There's some great moments in this episode too. Like this episode does a really great job at building an effective atmosphere between the fire scenes and when Rain is playing the guitar. I mean, there's some great moments in there that really build this atmosphere. So while this episode does have some knocks, it's the core of the episode plus the feel and the tone that's going for it should makes it a very unique episode. But I feel like the top three episodes we'll be talking about are more well-rounded as a whole, and because of that, I have this episode here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and we actually have the highest ranked season 1 episode left on the board, and it is the penultimate episode from that season. It is Agony of a Witch. Now, I'm sure a lot of you saw this coming. I mean, this is regarded as one of the best episodes in the series, and for good reason. I mean, there's a lot going on here, even if a lot of it is just build up towards the finale. I mean, this is the episode where Lilith reveals to Ida that she was the one that cursed on her in the first place. And obviously, that's a pretty emotional scene on its own, but it's even more interesting in when you know that Dana Terrace was working on Gravity Falls and is even engaged to Alex Hirsch. I mean, if you haven't watched that show, there's a very similar scene in that show. I won't spoil it, but there's a very similar scene that you can tell that some inspiration was drawn upon, but still very effective here. I mean, there's obviously the scheme of Luce trying to steal this artifact in the hopes that it might cure Ida's curse, but then Lilith is able to get around that, kidnap Luce, and really use that to get Ida to come to the castle. From there, there's obviously a very emotional and very impactful scene, like where they're battling each other, and Ida's trying to rescue Luce, but in the process, she uses up all of her magic and gets completely consumed by the curse. And obviously, it's a pretty dramatic ending where Lilith takes Ida in, and Luce is kind of left to go back to the Owl House. And obviously, that moment at the end where Luce comes back and Hootie and King are there asking her what happened, and obviously they know what happened, and obviously it's a pretty sad scene for them to end on. Obviously, that's the cliffhanger that leads to the finale. I mean, there's a lot of great stuff here, and I debated over whether to have this above the actual finale, which has a lot of the payoff to what this episode sets up. However, the more I thought about it, I realized that while the finale was really, really good, I feel like this episode does a lot of the build up stuff, but also serves as a good standalone episode where that cliffhanger really leaves you wanting more. And it's obviously a pretty impactful ending, even if it's just a standalone episode. So I love this episode a lot. It's definitely one of the best episodes of the season of the series, and certainly the best of season 1. But I just feel like there are just 2 episodes that edge it out that are just more complete experiences for me. And because of that, I had this episode here at number 3. All right, we're now down to the top 2. And at this point, you should probably know what those top 2 are. I feel like there are 2 pretty major episodes we haven't discussed yet. But at number 2, again, I really had to decide a bit, but at the end of the day, I figured this was pretty solidly the second best episode of the show. It's actually the final episode that is aired up to this point. It is Yesterday's Lie, and this episode is fantastic. Now, first off, V is an incredible character. Obviously, the fact that she's voiced by Michaela Dietz was pretty amusing, but outside of that, there's a lot going on with her. Granted, I could see this twist coming out of left field, as it's a pretty neat coincidence she went through the portal not long after Luce entered it, but I'll take this explanation over this doppelganger being an actual villain. On that note, I think V is a great metaphor for autistic people, where she literally masks herself to look quote unquote normal and fit in. Her idea of looking quote unquote normal is very cookie cutter, smoothing out any edge her weird self might have. I mean, the moment where Luz confronts her, scaring her into reverting back to her true form and not having the energy or means of transforming back, again, I feel like the parallel is pretty noticeable in my eyes. You have Luce helping her out along the way, learning the consequences of her decision to stay in the Boiling Isles. I mean, she finally learns what happened at the camp she was supposed to go to that triggered this all of the situation, and it turns out that it was kind of all for nothing, where the camp just wasn't that bad. I mean, Luce or V was able to make friends that are weird just like her, and it turns out that had Luce stayed behind, that she would have been just fine at the end, that all this anguish that she went through and all this suffering and this entire mess she went in, it's kind of all for nothing, and that's kind of poignant when I really think about it. You have the entire sequence of V being captured by this flat Earth conspiracy theorist. The plot of Luce getting Camilla to come rescue her, all while thinking it's some game. You have Camilla, like, saving the day and accepting V for who she is, followed by a very dramatic scene with her and Luce, where Luce kind of screws up her words, making Camilla think she was unhappy and that she kind of chose to stay in the Boiling Isles over, like, in Earth with her, and then Camilla makes Luce promise that she'll stay on Earth once she gets back. I know I just gave a plot summary here, but this episode is fantastic. I mean, so many great plot elements. I mean, we have V as a good character. The conflict is pretty interesting. And the scene where Luce is finally able to talk to Camilla kind of in person is very impactful, and I feel like it definitely sets things up for the rest of the series. I mean, it's kind of fitting in a way where this is the last episode that came out before the hiatus, and I know there are people that have mentioned that the show is canceled and there's uncertainty in the air. I feel like if this is the last episode, then it would obviously be pretty sad, but it's also kind of an epic way to finish, if you ask me. I mean, obviously, it leaves a lot of loose ends, but it's still very good that we at least got that scene. And it's a really good thing to leave in your mind as we're moving into either the end of the series or towards the second half of season two and the rest of the series. This is a great episode, but there's just one episode that I feel like is more well rounded, one that is a more complete experience. Whereas this is definitely one that I relate to more on a personal level, and one where I just get really attached to V. So, because of that, I have this episode here at number two, a fantastic episode, but I feel like there's one episode that is slightly better. And now, at number one, the best episode of the Owl House for me should be very obvious at this point. It's Knock Knock Knocking on Hootie's Door. And for me, this is clearly the best episode of the show. I want to say Yesterday's Lie is an episode I resonate with more on a personal level, largely due to V. This episode comes pretty close to that while also being more well rounded. I know I'm not the first person to say this, but who would have thought that a Hootie focus episode could give us so much? The premise is wholesome enough, with Hootie wanting to help out his friends, but no matter what he does, he keeps screwing up, or at least thinks he is, and feels bad about it. I mean, there's him trying to help King figure out what kind of demon he's supposed to be. Admittedly, this is the lightest of the three situations, and the one where Hootie actually helping him out is kind of forced, but it's still pretty effective. Then there's him drugging Ida with cookies, causing her to have this weird dream that goes all over the place. In just a few minutes, we learn that she once attacked her father while in the Owl Beast mode. We see Rain breaking up with her, and we really get to see the Owl Beast as its own character. And the moment where the two reconcile is fantastic, kind of completing the metaphor of the curse being an SCD, which I alluded to in my initial reaction video, where Ida accepts it as a part of her, even if Hootie thinks he just made it worse. Great stuff there. And then there's Luce wanting to ask out Amity, prompting Hootie to kidnap Amity and set up this cheesy tunnel of love ride. And during the ride, we see Amity being flattered by how wholesome it is, while Luce is freaking out and destroying everything. But in doing so, Amity thinks that Luce is weirded out more than by the prospect of them dating, and in turn, seeing all this as a rejection of her own romantic feelings. The moment after the ride where Amity tears up and says how silly it would be for them to be dating, while Lou sees the misunderstanding she caused is great, which of course leads to Hootie's breakdown. He feels like a burden, and him ripping himself out of the house, saying that he'll never curse this home of his odious presence again, is kind of heartbreaking. And really, I think it speaks to how Hootie is perceived as a character. For so much of the show, he is looked at as this annoying comic relief character that doesn't do anything. And when he does do something, he screws it up. And this episode places all of that front and center, with him helping, but seemingly screwing up at everything he does. And then he feels bad about it. And when you add on top of that the actual situations he's involved with, connecting all the major storylines outside of the Day of Unity that have been happening so far, with King trying to find out who he is, with Ida coming to terms with her curse, with Luce finally admitting that she's gay for Amity. I mean, there's so much going on here, and it's just a very compact and well-rounded experience. I mean, this has to be number one. This is the best episode of the show because it has so much in its short runtime, and the fact that it's able to integrate all those things so well is the reason that I have this as the best episode of the Owl House for me. And there we go. That will do it for this video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. I'll probably do another one of these videos once the series ends, once we get more episodes. I'll definitely share my thoughts about the rest of the series from there. Definitely have more content like this moving forward, more episode rankings. Like I enjoy doing them, talking about different shows. But for now, that is the video. See ya.